Hey, TechLead here, and welcome back to another episode. Today we are drinking a yellowish water. What are you looking at? What I wanted to talk to you about today is how to communicate with a software engineer. And I'm guessing that you're probably like a software engineering manager, you've been appointed to be one, and now you need to learn how to communicate with your own team. You probably don't know how to code and you're way out of your league. When you accepted your job, you thought that these would be like normal people, but they're not. They're more like animals. Some of you may be dating a software engineer and there may be relationship troubles. You may find that communication is just difficult. It is breaking down everywhere. It seems like you are with a robot. Others of you may actually be software engineers and have trouble communicating with yourself. You don't quite know how to make sense of what has actually happened to you ever since you've picked up this profession. I'm here to help as an experienced ex-Google software engineer. Now, first of all, I should note that it is quite amazing that we are even able to communicate, you and I, because I'm a software engineer and you may not be one. And even if you are a software engineer, it can also be difficult for two software engineers to practically communicate with each other. I took this amazing leadership course where we did an exercise. Some of you may know it already. It is called the True Colors exercise, in which we categorize people as green, orange, blue, gold. Each person can be categorized as a color, and there are different personality types. Now, this was quite an interesting exercise for me because I had always thought that humans were fundamentally very similar and that they reacted very similar to one another, were rational, logical beings, but that's not actually quite true for many people. Green is the color for most engineers. They are very scientifically rational, objective people, but there's many other different colors. Blue is very touchy-feely, orange is much more action-oriented, leadership-oriented, gold is more process-oriented, and you'll find that everybody is kind of different. Many people, by the way, do not talk to software engineers, period. They will only communicate with a software engineer through a translator, otherwise known as like a software engineering manager. And this is a pretty good idea, actually, I would say, because if you attempt to communicate directly with a software engineer, you may accidentally offend them and bring their wrath upon you. You might find yourself being hacked or stalked by software engineers. Many of these people have not properly been socialized by our society, and yet they exist. You don't see them, but they spend a lot of their time underground in basements and garages, coding away, communicating with machines, and much of the time we are protected from them. Even inside companies, you might find that software engineers are relegated to a separate entire building where normal people don't have to necessarily communicate with them or interact with them or even see them in any way. But every now and then you may encounter one, and I have a few tips for you to protect yourself. The first tip is to communicate them using very simple if, then, else statements. This is a language construct used by programmers all the time, and they will understand this. So phrase your sentences like this, such as, if you want lunch, then come to the cafe at noon, else give me a call, end. You can also use do while statements for loops like, for example, if you're to say, while I am out, drink some coffee. The programmer might just keep drinking coffee in a repeated infinite loop until you come back. You want to make sure that you're using very precise language and you're not using words like maybe. In code, it's usually just true or false. There's nothing in between, it's binary. Questions need to be answered deterministically, which means that the answer to a certain question should be the same every time. Like, if I say, do you want pizza? Then the answer should be yes today, and it should be yes tomorrow. If I ask the same question and the answer is different each time I ask it, well, computers don't work that way. Computers always give the same answer. And if you were to change the answer, you might offend the programmer, you might piss them off. You want to leave your emotions out if possible. Engineers are trained such that even in scenarios where they're banging their heads on the keyboard because a program isn't working, there's no apologies, there's no emotions coming from the computer. They've already been trained in a manner such that emotions will get them nowhere. It's going to be a mistake if you're expecting pity or sympathy or any sort of emotion at all. It's really all going to be about cold hard facts. And similarly, when you're talking to a programmer, you don't necessarily need to show them sympathy or pity either. They're not necessarily expecting that. You can just give them horrible news, whatever. Whenever you start a conversation with an engineer, you want to clearly define the inputs and the outputs of the conversation. Unlike many conversations where a lot of people are reading in between the lines, looking at unspoken words, checking out the body gesture, looking at the face for clues. In a conversation with an engineer, you need to understand that when you're coding, the computer does not read between lines of code to try to understand some hidden message that's being written out there. The computer is just taking a look at exactly what's explicitly written out, and that is what a programmer expects as well. So for that reason, if you're in a relationship, for example, you're not going to want the engineer to be trying to read your mind, trying to understand what you're trying to say. Just be very explicit and direct about it. And so that's why I recommend that you use the word, these are my assumptions. Here are the givens. This is what I'm expecting. These are my expectations. These are my assumptions. Given these assumptions, this is the conclusion that I am reaching. And you don't necessarily want to say like, well, hey, do we want to go eat pizza maybe? No, that's not quite what you want to do. You want to say, given the assumption that you want pizza and I want pizza too, then we should go eat pizza. That is a very clear, understandable statement. A lot of people like to just grab a friend and go to a cafe and just talk. Just talk about life, talk about things. And when you think about it, you don't really do that when you write code. It's not like an engineer would just decide to have a random talk with a computer and just write a function that doesn't really do anything, has no purpose, just spins a few computer cycles, burns some extra energy, uses some power, and there's a set of random inputs and there's a set of random outputs. Coders don't quite do things like that. So it really helps if you're going to have a conversation, you define the output, the goal, the purpose of the conversation, and do it efficiently and effectively. The time and space complexity of your conversation are the two things you're going to want to focus on. The time complexity of your conversation has to do with how efficient your time usage is. How quickly are you conveying your thoughts? Are you going in circles, repeating the same facts over and over again in different ways? That's not efficient, and you're just going through multiple passes. Think about it this way. If your story can be optimally told in 10 seconds, but instead you started deviating around and talking about all sorts of random stuff, and it took you 100 seconds to tell your story, then that's like n squared time that you're using. You should optimally be using big O of n time. If you need to say the story twice in two different ways, that's maybe 2n time, that's still okay, but you want to avoid going into, say, polynomial or exponential time. That's like saying for each story you say, you need to go into a sub-story, and for each of those sub-stories, you need to go into another sub-story. Space complexity has to do with how much memory you're using. And this has to do with if you need to tell a story and then ask the coder to remember things, and you say, hey, do you remember that time we did this and the time we did that? And then do you remember 2 years ago this happened? And all of this is causing the person to have to keep track of many different things in their mind. That's using up a lot of space. The less space you can use, the better. And ideally, it's stateless, where you don't have to ask the programmer to remember anything or hold anything in their mind. You just have a certain request. There's nothing about recall. There's nothing about thinking about what happened yesterday. Generally, efficient conversations are going to have a time-space complexity of linear time, constant space. That's how many optimal algorithms are. If you need some more space, like you want to get into linear space, that might be okay too, but you do want to prioritize your time complexity. If you need additional help on this, you might want to do some leak code practice. Lastly, you want to think about the role of authority, and you want to be very careful about telling programmers what to do, because the source of truth for a programmer is not going to be you, it is going to be in the data, the metrics. Present to them the facts. An engineer is going to view you as just a body of bugs, potentially very buggy code. It's like interacting with a third-party API. Programmers are generally going to be very wary about depending on a third-party API for the function of whatever they're doing. This third-party API can fail. They're notorious for having a lot of bugs, being poorly developed, just having all sorts of random problems. Well, that third-party API is you, and if you start just issuing out commands, telling people things, every piece of knowledge that you're dishing out has to be verified and authenticated. There's otherwise very little reason to trust that any of this information is going to be correct. Most code are full of bugs. Most people are full of bad information. The other thing is, coders are generally the ones in the position of authority. They're the ones dishing out the commands. If a programmer makes a statement to you, you want to be very careful and try to obey that statement if at all possible, because if you don't, you can unleash hell upon yourself. It is like a computer that is refusing to obey a programmer's commands. This just doesn't happen in general. I don't know what would happen if you were to not do this. I would run if I were you. Just get out of that scenario, because who knows what can happen. Statements are issued and they are run, usually flawlessly. So that's the other thing, is you want to be very competent in whatever you're doing. If you're given a task to do by an engineer and then you failed a simple task, you don't do it right, you just need to remember your competition. Your competition are the machines. They're flawless. They're doing everything perfectly, on time, highly efficient, very quick, without fail, almost all the time, unless the compiler is wrong, which it almost never is. You want to try to be wrong about as often as the compiler is wrong. One thing I might comment on here is that there are two types of careers. The traditional type of career is one in which there's a lot of posing, a lot of acting. People want to make themselves look like more than they are. They want to project their personalities, project themselves. And this is about wearing suits, having a really smooth gelled hairstyle, and just looking the part, playing the part, speaking the part. And a lot of this is going to be useful for certain careers, like if you're doing negotiation, business deals, talking to investors, trying to sell something, sell a car, if you're a salesperson, marketing. A lot of these careers that deal with people, clients, partners, you're gonna want that. It's not really so genuine. However, you might notice that there's other types of careers, such as engineering or art, or even writing books. For a lot of these, the body of work stands on its own and it is evaluated on its own merits. When you visit a website or use an app, you don't really look at what type of hairstyle the programmer who wrote the app had, how he was talking, what type of suit he was wearing. I think for that reason, you may see many engineers who dress down, who dress very casual. And similarly for you, when you interact with them, it is very important that you're acting genuine and you're not projecting yourself or pretending to be more than you really are. This is why if you're to go to an engineering interview, slick your hair back, put on a suit, and put on some shiny shoes, you might get rejected. You could get kicked out so fast you wouldn't even have had time to demonstrate your firm handshake. Anyway, that'll do it for me. If you have any additional tips for how to communicate with software engineers, please post below in the comments. Love to hear what you guys think. If you liked the video, give it a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.